6 women, 6 very different fates. One man changed the course of history and destroyed lives in his obsession with a single music goal, a male heir. This is the story of Henry VIII, the king who broke from the Catholic Church, tore England apart music, and left a trail of blood and broken hearts in his wake. By the end of this video, you'll understand music, how a charismatic Renaissance prince transformed into one of history's most notorious music tyrants, and how the woman he valued became his greatest music legacy. Music to understand why Henry VIII became obsessed with marriage, divorce, and execution. We need to go back to where it all started. Because Henry VIII music was never supposed to be king. Born in 1491, Henry was the spare, not the heir. His older brother Arthur was groomed for the throne from birth, tutored in statecraft, betrothed to a Spanish princess named Catherine of Aragon to secure a powerful alliance. Young Henry, he was destined for the church, or perhaps a minor role in his brother's court. But in 1502, everything changed. Arthur died suddenly at just 15 years old, possibly from the sweating sickness that plagued Tudor, England. Overnight, 10-year-old Henry went from afterthought to the future of the Tudor dynasty. When Henry took the throne in 1509 at 17 years old, England rejoiced. Here was everything a Renaissance king should be. Tall, athletic, an accomplished musician and poet, fluent in music, multiple languages. He jousted, he hunted, he dazzled at court. One observer wrote that His Majesty is the handsomest potentate I ever set eyes on. But the shadow of his father's paranoid, penny-pinching music, reign hung over him. Henry VIII had won the music crown on the battlefield at Bosworth Field, ending the Wars of the Roses. But the Tudor claim to the throne was shaky, challenged by music, Yorkist pretenders. Henry VIII's response had been to hoard wealth and eliminate rivals' music, ruthlessly. Henry VIII wanted to be different. He wanted glory, not just survival. He wanted to be remembered as a music great king, a warrior king, a king whose dynasty would last forever. And for that music, he needed sons, lots of them. It was this need, this obsession that would lead music him to marry 6 times, break with 1,000 years of Catholic tradition, and send 2 of his wives to the executioner's block. Our story, Truly Music, begins with the first of those 6 wives, the woman who was married to Henry longer than all the others combined. The first wife, the one who music lasted longest, the one Henry loved until he didn't. Born a Spanish princess in 1485, Catherine was a near-perfect Renaissance music, queen, educated, pious, dignified, and politically connected. She was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the power couple who had united Spain and funded music, Columbus' voyage to the New World. But Catherine's story with England began with tragedy. At 15, she was moved to England to marry Prince Arthur, Henry's older brother, in a grand political alliance. But as we know, 5 months later, Arthur was dead. Catherine became stranded in a foreign country, her future uncertain. For 7 years, she lived in limbo, too valuable to send home, but with no clear role. She was kept in near poverty while Henry VIII and Ferdinand haggled over her dowry and her fate. Then Henry VIII died, and suddenly 17-year-old Henry VIII was king. One of his first acts was marrying his brother's widow. It seemed romantic music, a young king rescuing a princess in distress. But there was also cold political calculation. The Spanish alliance was valuable, and marrying Catherine meant Henry didn't have to return her dowry. There was just one problem. Church law forbade a man from marrying his brother's widow. Music, it was considered incest based on a verse in the book of Leviticus. But Henry VIII music had secured a papal dispensation, special permission from the Pope based on Catherine's sworn testimony music that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated. She was, she insisted, still a virgin. For the first 15 years, the marriage was genuinely happy. Catherine was intelligent, politically astute, and a capable regent. When Henry Music went to war in France in 1513, he left her in charge of England. And when Scotland invaded while he was gone, Catherine's forces crushed them at the Battle of Flodden, killing the Scottish king. She sent Henry Music, the bloodied coat of James IV, as a trophy. But there was one crucial failure: sons. Catherine became pregnant at least 6 times. She had miscarriages, stillbirths, sons who lived only days or weeks. The only child who survived was a daughter born in 1516, Mary. In that music era, a daughter wasn't good enough. England had never successfully been ruled by a queen. The memory of civil war, the Wars of the Roses that had nearly destroyed England music, was still fresh. Without a male heir, everything Henry's father had music built could collapse into chaos. By the early 1520s, Catherine was in her late 30s, past childbearing age by Tudor music standards, and Henry's eye had begun to wander. Her name music was Anne Boleyn. Anne was magnetic, sophisticated, educated in the French court, witty, but crucially, she refused to become Music Henry's mistress. Henry had had mistresses before, but Anne wanted marriage, and Henry became obsessed. By 1527, Henry had convinced himself music, that his marriage to Catherine, was cursed by God. That verse in Leviticus, if a man shall take his music brother's wife, it is an unclean thing, they shall be childless. Surely this explained music everything. Never mind that he had a daughter. In Henry's mind, music daughters didn't count. He called it his great matter. He needed the music pope to annul his marriage, to declare it had never been valid. But their music was a massive problem. The pope was essentially a prisoner of Catherine's nephew, Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor who had just sacked Rome. The pope couldn't possibly annul the music marriage of Charles's aunt without enraging the most powerful man in Europe. For 6 years, the case dragged on. Catherine fought back with dignity, music, and determination. When called before the court at Blackfriars in 1529, she knelt before Henry and delivered one of the most powerful speeches in Tudor history, insisting her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated, that her marriage to Henry was valid, and appealing her case to Rome. Henry wouldn't even look at her, but Catherine's resistance-only music made Henry more determined and more radical. If the Pope wouldn't give him what he wanted, he'd break with Rome entirely. In 1533, Henry Music married Anne Boleyn in secret while still technically married to Catherine. Then he appointed a new Archbishop Music of Canterbury who declared his marriage to Catherine invalid. England broke from the Catholic Church. Henry declared himself supreme, head of the Church Music of England. Catherine was stripped of her title. She was no longer Queen Music, just the Dowager Princess of Wales, Arthur's widow. She was separated from her daughter Mary and sent away to increasingly isolated, uncomfortable castles. She never saw Henry or Mary again. For 3 years, Catherine lived in exile in her own adopted country, refused to acknowledge the annulment music, and continued to sign her letters, Catherine the Queen. She died music in January 1536. Possibly of cancer, possibly of a broken heart. She was 50 years old. Her last music letter was to Henry, and it ended, "Lastly, I make this vow that mine music eyes desire you above all things." When Henry heard of her death, he dressed in music, yellow, the color of joy in some contexts, mourning in others, and celebrated. Some said it was relief. Some said it was guilt music, disguised as triumph. Catherine of Aragon had been Queen of England for music, 24 years. She had been loyal, capable, and dignified. Her reward was humiliation, exile, and separation from music, her only child. But there was an irony to this. Her daughter Mary would eventually become queen, ruling for 5 years, music albeit earning the nickname Bloody Mary. And Mary never forgot what Henry had done to her mother. Catherine was gone. Anne Boleyn music was queen, and Henry's nightmare was just beginning. Anne Boleyn, the woman who changed England forever. Born around 1501, the exact date is uncertain. Anne was the daughter of an ambitious courtier, Thomas Boleyn, who sent her to the Netherlands and then France to be music, educated at the most sophisticated courts in Europe. When she returned to England in 1522, music she was unlike anyone Henry had ever met. While other English ladies were demure music and traditional, Anne was sharp-witted, fashionable in the French style, and utterly music, self-possessed. For 7 years, Henry had pursued her. 7 years of love letters, gifts, promises. Anne held firm, watching as Henry Music dismantled his marriage to Catherine, defied the Pope, and tore England away from Rome, all to make her his wife. By the time they music had married secretly in 1533, Anne was already pregnant. Everything Henry had music sacrificed until now was betting on one outcome, that Anne would give him a son. On September 7th, music, 1533, Anne gave birth to a daughter. Henry tried to hide his disappointment, but Anne knew she'd seen what happened to Catherine, and now music she had to get pregnant again immediately or face the same fate. The music next few years were a nightmare of miscarriages. Anne became pregnant again in 1534 but miscarried. Music, then again the pressure was unbearable. Her behavior became erratic. She was sharp-tongued, music, jealous, volatile. Some historians think she was simply terrified. Others suggest she was always headstrong and Henry had just stopped finding it charming. On the same music, day Catherine was buried in 1536, Anne miscarried once again a boy. And this time Henry had had enough, some sources claim Henry burst into her chamber and shouted that he saw clearly God would not give him male children with her. Whether that's true or not, something shifted. Henry Music began to believe that his marriage to Anne was as cursed as his marriage to Catherine had been. But unlike Catherine, there was no biblical excuse. Anne would have to be removed another way. Henry's chief minister, Music Thomas Cromwell, began building a case. It was monstrous. Anne was accused of adultery with 5 men, including her own brother, George. She was accused of plotting the king's death. The charges were almost certainly false. The timeline of the alleged affairs was physically impossible, but truth didn't matter. Henry wanted rid of her. Anne was arrested later that year and taken to the Tower of London, the same place where she'd stayed in luxury music before her coronation just 3 years earlier. Now she was Music, a prisoner accused of treason. The 5 men accused with her music were tried and executed. First, then Anne herself was tried before a court of peers, including her own uncle who presided over the proceedings. The verdict was decided before the trial began. Music, guilty. Anne was sentenced to be burned at the stake or beheaded at the king's pleasure. Henry, Music, in a gesture some call mercy and others call vanity, brought in an expert swordsman from France instead of using an axe. It would be quicker, cleaner. On May 19, 1536, Anne was led to a scaffold on Tower Green. She wore a grey dama's gown with an irreverent mantle and a white quay. She prepared a speech. It was careful, music, diplomatic, not quite a confession, but not quite a denial. She praised the king and asked people to pray for her. Her last reported music words were a prayer asking God to have mercy on her soul. The swordsman Music struck. Anne Boleyn was dead at around 35 years old. Her body was placed in an arrow chest. There wasn't even a proper coffin, and buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Ventula in the Tower. Anne's daughter Elizabeth was declared Music, illegitimate just as Mary had been. At 2 years old, Elizabeth had lost her mother and her status in one blow. No one could have predicted that this rejected, illegitimate daughter would become Elizabeth I, one of England's music greats. Anne Boleyn's legacy is complicated. She was ambitious, clever, and brave Music, enough to demand marriage when others would have settled for less. She changed the course of English history. The break from Rome, the seeds of the English Reformation, all came about because of Henry's obsession with her. But in the end, like Catherine before her, she discovered a terrible truth. When you were Henry VIII's wife, your value began and ended with your ability to produce sons. Henry's music fortune all changed with his next wife. But as you might come to expect, it wasn't that simple. Jane Seymour, the quiet one. If Anne Boleyn was fire, Jane Seymour was water. Pale, demure, soft-spoken. Music, she was everything Anne was not. And that was exactly the point. Born around 1508, Jane came from respectable but not particularly distinguished music gentry. She'd served as lady-in-waiting to both Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, watching from the sidelines as both queens rose and fell. Jane Music learned from their mistakes. When Henry's eye turned to her in 1535, she played it perfectly. She was modest, submissive, virtuous. When Henry sent Music, her a letter and a purse of gold, she returned them both, kissing the letter but refusing to open it, saying she was a gentle woman of good and honorable family who valued her honor above all. Henry, exhausted by Anne's volatile music temperament, found it irresistible. The day after Anne Boleyn's execution, Henry was betrothed to Jane. 11 days later, on May 30th, 1536, they were married. There was no elaborate coronation music for Jane. Henry couldn't afford to look too eager. And besides, she'd have to prove herself Music first. Prove herself by giving him a son. For over Music, a year. Nothing happened, no pregnancy. Henry began to Music grow anxious. 2 wives, 1 daughter each, and still no male heir. Was he cursed? Would he have to go through this nightmare again? Then in early 1537, Jane became pregnant. This time, Henry was music cautious. He'd been disappointed too many times. But as the pregnancy progressed without incident, hope music began to build. Prayers were said across England. Everything was music prepared for the birth of the prince. On October 12, 1537, after a difficult labor lasting 2 days and 3 nights, Jane gave birth to a son, Edward. Henry Music finally had his male heir. The prince he torn England apart to conceive. The son he defied the Pope, broken music with Rome, destroyed 2 marriages, and executed a wife to obtain. The celebrations were extraordinary. Bonfires blazed across London. Bells rang from every church. Henry wept with joy. After 28 years of marriage across 3 wives, he finally had a music, legitimate son. But Jane never recovered. She developed childbed fever, likely a postpartum infection. For 12 days, she lingered, drifting in and out of consciousness. The doctors were helpless. On October 24, 1537, just 12 music days after giving birth to the future Edward VI, Jane Seymour died. She was about 29 years old. Henry was devastated. Of all his wives, Jane was the one he genuinely mourned. He wore black for months. He had her buried with full honors at Windsor Castle. And years later, when he died, he would be buried beside her. Why Jane? Some say it was because she gave him Edward. Others suggest it was because she died before Henry Music could grow tired of her, before she could disappoint him, before reality music could tarnish the image. She remained perfect because she remained frozen music in time, the wife who gave him everything and asked for nothing in return. Jane's son Edward would become King Edward VI, but he was sickly from birth. He would reign for only 6 years before dying at 15. The male heir. Henry had music, sacrificed everything to produce, dying young and childless, making all of it meaningless. But that music was years away. In 1537, Henry had his son, and after a period of music mourning, he'd be looking for wife number 4. This time, it wouldn't be about love or passion. It would be music about politics, and it would be a disaster. After Jane's death in 1537, Henry was alone again. He was 46 years old, overweight, with an ulcerated leg that caused him constant pain. The Golden Prince of 159 was long gone, but he was still king, and England needed alliances. His chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, had a plan, a marriage alliance with the Protestant princes of Germany. The Duchy of Cleves was perfectly positioned, not too powerful to threaten music England, but connected enough to matter, and they had an available princess, Anne. The problem was that Henry had never seen her. In the 16th century, you couldn't just video call your potential bride. So Henry Music did what royal families did. He sent the court painter Hans Hollein to paint her portrait. Music, Holbein's portrait showed a serene, dignified woman in elaborate German dress. Henry looked at it and approved the match. Negotiations began. A treaty was signed Music and set sail for England in late 1539. She arrived on New Year's Day 1540. Henry, ever the music romantic, decided to surprise her. He'd read too many chivalric romances where the king disguises himself Music to test his bride's true feelings. So he dressed as a messenger and burst into her chamber while she was watching bear baiting Music from her window. It went catastrophically wrong. Anne didn't recognize him. Why would she? She'd never seen him. She was startled and confused by this large, foul-smelling stranger. Henry Music was humiliated. He stormed out, returned in his royal clothes, and tried again. But the magic was Music broken. That night, Henry complained bitterly to Cromwell. He called Anna Flanders mare. He said she was nothing like her. Portrait that she was plain, Music that she smelled bad, that he found her completely unattractive. But the treaty was signed. Music, the diplomatic wheels were in motion. Henry felt trapped. The wedding went ahead on January 6th, Music, 1540. It was Henry's 4th marriage in less than 4 years, but there was a Music immediate problem. Henry wouldn't consummate the marriage. He claimed Music had no desire for her. His gentlemen of the bedchamber were questioned about the intimate details. It was humiliating for everyone involved. For 6 months, the unconsummated marriage Music limped along. Henry desperately searched for a way out. Then he found one. If the marriage was never consummated, it could be annulled on the grounds of non-consent. Anne, he claimed, music had been pre-contracted to another man anyway. Her previous betrothal had never been properly dissolved. In July 1540, Henry summoned Anne and asked her to agree to music annulment. And here's where Anne showed her intelligence. She said yes, no. Drama, no fighting. Music, no claiming her rights as queen. Anne of Cleves looked at what had happened to Catherine and Anne Boleyn and made the smartest decision of her life. She let him go. In exchange for her cooperation, Henry was extraordinarily generous. He gave her a massive settlement, castles, manors, a huge income. He called her his beloved sister. She was given precedence at court over every woman except Music, the king's wife and daughters. She kept her status, her wealth, and most importantly, her head. Anne lived comfortably in England for the rest of her life. She attended court functions. She maintained friendly relations with Henry and later with his children. She outlived him by 10 years. Of all Henry's wives, she had perhaps the happiest ending. Wealthy, independent, and alive. The marriage had lasted just 6 months. No one was hurt, but Thomas Cromwell wasn't so lucky. Henry blamed him for the disastrous match. Within weeks of the annulment, Cromwell was arrested, attainted for treason, and executed. The man who had engineered Henry's break from Rome and the dissolution of the monasteries was beheaded on July 28, 1540. On the very same day Cromwell died, Henry married again, wife number 5. And this time he truly believed he'd found love. Catherine Howard, the rose without music, a thorn. Where Anne of Cleves had been too old and plain for Henry's tastes, Catherine Howard was the opposite. She was young, probably 17 or 18 when Henry noticed her. She was pretty, vivacious, and full of life. And Henry, now nearly 50, fat, diseased, and in constant pain, was utterly besotted. Catherine was Anne Boleyn's first cousin, another Howard girl sent to court to catch the king's eye. But unlike Anne, Catherine had no political sophistication, no cunning, no understanding of the deadly game she was playing. She'd grown up neglected in the household of her step-grandmother, the Dare Duchess of Norfolk. It was a chaotic environment where young women had minimal supervision. Catherine had already had at least 2 romantic entanglements before Henry ever noticed her. A music teacher named Henry Manx and a young man named Francis Darham who called her his wife. But in 1540 when the aging king's attention fell on her, Catherine's family saw an opportunity. They pushed her forward. And Catherine, young and probably flattered, didn't resist. Henry married her on July 28, 1540. Where his marriage to Anne of Cleves had been a political calculation gone wrong, his marriage to Catherine was pure infatuation. He called her his rose without a thorn, his jewel of womanhood. He showered her with gifts, lands, and jewelry. For a brief moment, Catherine made Henry feel young again. He dressed in bright colors. He threw feasts and danced. The old man was in love. But Catherine was essentially a child married to a diseased, temperamental tyrant old enough to be her grandfather. While Henry was infatuated, Catherine was trapped. Within months of the marriage, Catherine began an affair with Thomas Culper, a gentleman of the king's privy chamber. Whether it was love, recklessness, or desperation is debated. Catherine's past also came back to haunt her. Francis Darham, her former lover, appeared at court and was given a position in her household. Whether Catherine invited him or whether he forced his way in through blackmail isn't clear, but the situation was explosive. In November 1541, everything fell apart. While Henry was at prayer, Archbishop Cranmer handed him a letter detailing Catherine's past relationships and current affair. At first, Henry didn't believe it. His rose without a thorn, couldn't have betrayed him. But the investigation began. Servants were questioned. Torture was threatened. The stories came out. The midnight meetings, the love letters, the gifts exchanged between Catherine and Culper. Henry was devastated. He wept in front of his council, not with grief, but with rage and humiliation. Once again, he'd been made a fool. Once again, a wife had betrayed him. Catherine was arrested and confined to Sion House. She was never formally charged or tried. Parliament simply passed a bill of attainder declaring her guilty. Francis Darham and Thomas Culper were tried and executed first. Darem was hung, drawn, and quartered as music, a traitor. Culper, because of his noble birth, was merely music beheaded. Then it was Catherine's turn. On February 13th, 1542, she was taken from house to the Tower of London by barge. Legend says she music spent the night before her execution practicing laying her head on the block, wanting to music, meet death with dignity. She was about 19 years old. The next morning, February 13th, 1542, Catherine Music Howard and her lady-in-waiting, Jane Boleyn, Anne Boleyn's sister-in-law, who had allegedly helped arrange music, the meetings with Culper, were both executed on Tower Green. Catherine's last music words are disputed. Some sources say she asked for mercy, while others claim music she confessed to deserving death. The most poignant account says she simply asked to music, be remembered in people's prayers. Henry never spoke of her again. He had loved her, or at least loved what she music represented to him, youth, beauty, vitality. But in the end, music, like with all his wives, she was disposable. Catherine Howard's story is perhaps the saddest of all Henry's wives. She wasn't politically ambitious like music Anne Boleyn. She wasn't a foreign princess like Catherine of Aragon or Anne of Cleves. She was music, just a young girl from a noble family used by her relatives, married to a monster and executed before she was 20. 2 wives executed now. And Henry had one more marriage left in him. This time it would be different. Music, Catherine Parr, the one who looked after Henry during his final music years. By 1543, Henry was 52 years old and falling apart. The ulcer music on his leg had become so infected that some days he couldn't walk. He was massively obese. His armor from this period music shows a waist circumference of over 50 in. He was in music, constant pain, often bedridden, and his temperament had become increasingly paranoid and violent. He needed a nurse more than a wife music, and that's exactly what he got. Catherine Parr was 31 when Henry Music chose her, older than any of his previous brides, except Catherine of Aragon. She was educated, intelligent, and already Music twice widowed. She'd been married at 17 to an elderly man who died, Music, then married again to a man she actually loved, Lord Latimer, who had also recently died. When Henry's attention Music turned to her, Catherine was in love with someone else. Thomas Seymour, the brother of Music, Jane Seymour, and uncle to Prince Edward. They'd been courting. Marriage seemed Music likely. Then the king intervened. Catherine couldn't refuse. But unlike his previous Music wives, Catherine approached the marriage with clear eyes. She knew what had happened to Catherine Howard and Anne Boleyn. She knew the king was dangerous, unpredictable, Music, and capable of turning on anyone. So she made herself indispensable, not as a romantic partner, but as a companion, a nurse, and a stepmother to his children. They married on Music, July 12, 1543 at Hampton Court Palace. It was a small, quiet ceremony. No grand celebrations. Henry was in too much pain, and everyone knew this marriage was practical rather than passionate. Catherine threw herself into her role. She tended to Henry's terrible leg wound, which stank and oozed constantly. She managed his household. She read to him, discussed theology with him, and kept him company through his darkest moods. Most importantly, she reconciled Music Henry with his daughters. Mary and Elizabeth had both been declared illegitimate and excluded from court. Catherine persuaded Music Henry to bring them back, to restore them to the succession, to treat them as his children again. The Act of Succession of 1544 put them back in line for Music, the throne after Edward, a decision that would ultimately shape England's future. But Catherine's music, intelligence, and education nearly became her downfall. She was a committed Protestant reformer. She published music, religious writings, becoming the first Queen of England to publish a book under her own name. At first, Henry enjoyed music, these intellectual conversations. But as his health declined and his paranoia increased, Catherine's religious views music became dangerous, conservative factions at court, led by Stephen Gardiner, Bishop of Winchester, saw an opportunity Music to bring down another queen. In 1546, they drew up articles against Catherine for Music heresy. A warrant was issued for her arrest. If she'd been questioned and charged, she would almost certainly have been found guilty, and the penalty for heresy was burning at Music, the stake. But Catherine found out about the plot just in time. She went to Henry and played the role perfectly. She was humble, submissive, tearful. She told him she only debated theology to distract him from his pain, to learn from his superior wisdom. She said she, a mere woman, could never presume to instruct her husband and lord. Henry was emlified. When the guards came to arrest her the next day, Henry sent them away, calling them fools and beasts. Catherine had talked her way out of execution. For the last year of Henry's life, Catherine continued to care for him. By the end, he was barely mobile, hoisted by machinery. His leg music infection so severe that servants could smell him from rooms away. He died on January 28, 1547 at 55 years old. Catherine Music Parr was free. Within months, she married the man she'd loved all along, Thomas Seymour. She was music, finally able to marry for love. She became pregnant for the first time at 36. On August 30th, 1548, she gave birth music to a daughter. But like Jane Seymour before her, Catherine tragically developed childbed fever. She died music on September 5, 1548, just 6 days after giving birth. She was 36 years old. Of all Henry's wives, Catherine Parr had perhaps the most remarkable impact. She published books. She influenced religious reform. She saved Henry's daughters and restored them to the succession, ensuring that music, both Mary and Elizabeth, would eventually become queens. Henry VIII had married 6 times. He had executed 2 wives, divorced 2, and lost 1 to childbirth. Only Catherine P. survived him. Henry VIII died believing music, his legacy was secure. He had his son Edward. He had broken England free from Rome. Music, he had transformed the monarchy into an absolute power that answered to no one. Not the Pope, not the nobility, not even God's law as he saw it. But history had other plans. Edward VI, the son Henry sacrificed everything to produce, died at 15 without heirs. Then came Mary, Catherine of Aragon's daughter, music. The one Henry had declared illegitimate and separated from her mother. She became Mary I, ruling for 5 bloody years, attempting to reverse her father's Protestant Reformation and restore England to Catholicism. And finally, music. Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter, the disappointment, the illegitimate Princess Henry had ignored. Music, she became Elizabeth I and reigned for 45 glorious years. She defeated the Spanish Armada. She presided over England's golden age. She made England a world power. She never married, never had children, and proved that a woman could rule as well as or better than music, any king. The irony is perfect. The daughter Henry valued least became his greatest achievement. His legacy wasn't the son he wanted. It was the daughters he dismissed. If you enjoyed this journey through the tumultuous reign of Henry VIII and want to explore more of England's fascinating royal history, check out our comprehensive video covering every monarch of England from the Anglo-Saxons to the modern age.